Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to see you all here. And it's extremely nice to be embarking on a new series of lectures, and I'm incredibly grateful to Gresham College for putting up with me still. It's very nice that I'm still surviving and not been sacked. What I'm going to talk about over the next few lectures is royal palaces. Some of you may know that that's where I started my research. My PhD was looking at Henry VIII's palaces, and I'm just embarking on a series of research projects now, a major one on Windsor Castle, but also to rewrite some of the material that, slightly to my horror, I discovered I published over 20 years ago now, and that's, I suppose, what happens to you eventually. You sort of make yourself out of date. So what I'm going to be talking about this evening is the origins, I suppose, of royal building in England. I've just put these kings up on the screen here just to remind ourselves of the period we're talking about. I'm actually going to go back into the Saxon period, but I will be very specifically ending with Edward the Third. But before I start, I just want to just explain in a nutshell what I think happens in this early period. And what I want to show is that by the death of Edward III, English royal palaces had undergone a fundamental change. They changed from being a conglomeration of disparate buildings focused around a great hall to a well-organised, carefully planned group of structures that became a machine for ruling in, a house of power, buildings that were perfectly honed for medieval kingship. And what I want to try and do this evening is explain some of the reasons why this happened and actually how it happened. But I think to understand this, we need to understand a little about how medieval kings lived and ruled, and as an introduction, I think, a little about what actually constituted a palace. And to help us sort of understand this, I want to divide royal residences as they were used after the Norman conquest into three specific categories: the manor, the castle, and the palace. Now, I am, in principle, rather against creating categorizations that didn't exist at the time. But I think it is helpful to adopt this categorization to try and make sense of what otherwise is a bit of a confusing story. So let's start with the notion of a palace, because this is really quite straightforward. Because the word palace derives from the residence of the Roman emperors on the Palatine Hill in Rome. And here is the palace of Tiberius and Caligula there. The palace was the principal residence of the ruler, and as such, there could only be one. There could be only one building that was actually called a palace. And if you look at English royal buildings in the Middle Ages, that is exactly what you find. The only building to be called Palatium is, in fact, Westminster Palace, the Palace of Westminster. And as the monarch's principal residence, it was exceptional and unusual in very many ways, and we'll come on to look at that in a few moments. So there was a palace, then there were buildings, residential buildings, that were essentially in military structures, or at least had their origin in military structures. Today we might want to call them castles, places which had the primary role of subduing the local population, of overawing them with their size and strength, and accommodating not only the king, but also his military retinue, if necessary. Lastly, we then have residences that were undefended, set in hunting grounds and designed for royal recreation and pleasure. And these we might call manors, but at the time they were normally described as the king's houses, and they were called houses in the plural, even though they related to a single building. So a palace like Clarendon, which we'll go on to talk about in a minute, was described as the king's houses. And that is a very important point, which I will come on to in a moment. And in all these three different types of residence, the principal component was a large hall. a multifunctional space for feasting, for the reception of guests, and for the accommodation of the royal retinue, for the dispensing of royal justice, and for presiding over various types of assembly. And it was only the very rich and the very powerful who needed or could build such structures. Because not only did they take very considerable resources in terms of timber and iron and perhaps stone, but they required a capable designer and skilled workmen and a large number of labourers to construct. And generally speaking, these halls were located in the middle of large estates, land holdings that would produce the food and the firewood needed to keep a liberal house with lavish hospitality. And this is why all of the monarchs and many of the aristocrats had many such manors, because as they moved around the countryside, they consumed, rather like a plague of locusts, everything edible in their path. So the halls thus signified lordship, and the larger the hall, the more important the person was. And in this sort of architectural mine's bigger than yours, the royal halls were normally the largest and most spectacular. So where did this notion of the hall actually come from? Well, I suppose the simple answer is that rulers from time immemorial needed large rooms in which they and their supporters could gather, and where they could receive their subjects and feast. And you can see this in the buildings of rulers from the very earliest times. But the very specific type of hall that was in fact adopted by the Anglo-Saxon kings, I think very clearly had their roots in the very large assembly halls built by the Romans. And here you see the a Roman villa. This is at Brading on the Isle of Wight. And do I have a pointer here? No, it doesn't look as if I do. So this big structure up here is a great big hall, great big timber-framed hall. And what is absolutely certain is that after the Roman legions left England, many of these halls continued to stand for many hundreds of years. And therefore, the early Saxons were able to use these great Roman timber halls themselves. And this, I think, formed the backbone of the reason why these halls were seen as being so important. So what do we know about the earliest ones? Well, in the 620s, a remarkable palatial complex was constructed for the Northumbrian king Edwin at Yavering in Northumberland. This has been excavated. This is a reconstruction drawing what was there. And you can see here in the middle of this reconstruction the hall itself, 82 feet long, 36 feet wide. Its entrances, the principal entrances, were in the middle of the long sides of each. And inside, as far as we understand the archaeology, there were two internal cross walls making sort of separate rooms at each end. And that's probably this structure that you can see here on the reconstruction. And this hall had to have big posts, it had aisles, so it was a sort of pretty interrupted space. So these great halls built by the early Anglo-Saxon kings basically continued through the Anglo-Saxon period. Alfred the Great's biographer, Asser, writes of him having, and I quote, royal halls and chambers marvellously constructed of stone and wood. And of course, this is 250 years after this building is built in the 890s. And here there is a rather austere plan showing, in fact, it looks incredibly austere, so austere that you can't actually see the bit which I wanted to show you, which it's probably because the lights are on the stage. But anyway, you have to take my word for it. There's a great big hall there with sort of bowed sides, again, entered in the middle of the long sides, not at the end, entered in the middle of the long sides, constructed by Alfred the Great. Now, I'm a little bit anxious that my next slide won't show up either. Great. It is, I think, because of the light on the stage. But what this slide would show, if you could see it, are some, thank you for dimming the lights, I mean, it seems to make absolutely no difference whatsoever, is some excavated pieces of timber, which were excavated in London and are in this very museum, which are recovered from a great hall, a timber hall of the period of Alfred the Great, and were reused in the revetments of the River Thames. And what this shows is the incredibly elaborate carved woodwork in the upper parts of these halls. And from these very precious survivals, miraculously preserved from the 8th century, we know that these halls were very richly carved and decorated. Well, perhaps slightly surprisingly, the Norman conquest didn't really bring any significant changes to the nature of royal life, or even to the structures that comprised a rural royal manor. And I think we can best illustrate this by looking at the royal manor of Clarendon, which was the most important royal house in the west of England, spectacularly sited on a hill outside Salisbury. And you can still go there. English Heritage has put a great deal of money into helping the owner consolidate the remains. As a public footpath, you can go up there and you can still see this very important, very, very early royal palace. There was a Saxon house there. We know nothing about it. William the Conqueror completely rebuilt it, extended it. And by the reign of Henry II, it had become one of the 3 largest houses in the kingdom. And by 1164, it was capable of accommodating a great council, which had 14 bishops and many lay magnates. And you can see from this reconstruction, again based on the archaeology, that it was a complex of 1- and 2-storey buildings with pitched and tiled roofs, arranged, running in a great long line here, with a great hall at the centre. At this end, a conglomeration of buildings detached from the great hall, probably very sensibly because kitchens were dangerous, they caught alight, so that square building there is the kitchen detached from the great hall. And at this end, various royal buildings stretching up. I'll show you a plan of it in a few minutes, stretching up this way and further down here, stables, mills, wine cellars, granaries, etc., etc. And these buildings were linked together by pentices. You can see here these low sort of cloisters to allow you to get from one building to the other in the dry, but certainly not, I guess, on cold days in the warm. And this building we have an extraordinary full documentary record of, and we learn that the buildings inside were panelled with timber, certainly up to dado level. The timber panelling was painted green, with applied gold stars cast in lead and gilded. And the walls above were painted with murals depicting religious scenes. A very magnificent chapel. And in the British Museum, still today, some of you may know this, you can see it. She may not currently be on show because it's redoing the gallery that this is in, I think. But this fabulous tiled pavement, which was one of a number of pavements which was in this house. So this was a really luxurious, magnificent place. And the buildings themselves were set in a much bigger landscape setting. And again, I apologise for the way this is so bleached out, but this is where the buildings are, right in the centre. Here is the paling, the ditch and fence that went all the way around the park. There were 8 lodges at different points. You can see the little dots around there, which allowed access to the park. There was a band of woods across the middle, which were protected so that the deer couldn't get in. Towards the north, there were a series of meadows, and towards the south, there were a series of meadows. And the whole of the house was arranged so that as you came in from Slaygate over here, you could see the house perched up, the king's houses perched up on the ridge, painted white and sort of gleaming in the light. And this is the sort of panorama you would have got. And you can see, I think, why they are called the King's Houses. Clarendon was the King's Houses, because there's this very strong sense of a series of individual structures linked together with these pentaces. And so the palace and its grounds and in its park and its gardens were designed very much with the intention of providing pleasure for the monarchs who used it. Henry I, Henry II, John, Edward I and Edward III. They all hunted here. They all stayed here and used it as a sort of relaxing countryside retreat. So I hope that you can see, looking at Clarendon, that although it was large, richly decorated and carefully sited in a designed landscape, the core buildings actually were not materially different in layout from its Saxon predecessors. There was basically a sort of axial planning around a great hall. So this is the plan of Clarendon you see here, with, as I said before, the great hall in the centre. These rooms here are the king's chambers. There are some rooms here for the queen. Here's the chapel, the wine cellar. This is a slightly perhaps more sophisticated version of what the Saxon kings themselves were living in. This sort of continuity of plan between these very early Saxon houses and these early medieval houses, I think suggests a continuity of function, with these royal households living very much like their predecessors. These were war bands. They were living, eating, drinking, sleeping communally, always on the move, restless, hungry, busy. And at the heart of their life was still the hall, a structure of fundamental importance to anyone of any means and pretension, not only just to royalty. This hall signified the owner's social standing and was the centre of their public life. And very few of these early ones survive, but the one that I think is the most evocative, it isn't a royal one, is at Oakum in Rutland. It was built around 1190, and it's of 4 bays. It's got low aisles. You can see the low aisles here. Ignore those little dormer windows. They're later. The entrance door has actually been moved, and it's been moved into the centre. The entrance door was really originally down here. And if we look inside, you can see these great big aisles, the Norman decoration. This bizarre thing, if you've ever been there, this bizarre thing of the horseshoes. You might wonder what it is, but every time a member of the royal family visits Oakum, which you wouldn't have thought that often, but they do, they give a horseshoe, and the horseshoe is put on the walls of the thing. It was very charming, very nice. But you going in there, you do get this extraordinary sense of one of these very early halls. And if you somehow can half close your eyes and imagine the big tables down the centre, huge amounts of alcohol and food being consumed, lots of drunken singing, you could be back in the times of Beowulf, virtually. So it does seem that as well as the halls, there were these separate buildings, often completely detached for the king, which meant that he didn't actually have to sleep with his retinue in the Great Hall, although without any doubt the retinue did sleep in the Great Hall. And at Clarendon, as you see on the plan here, there was a separate room for the Queen, giving them both a measure of privacy. Now, I'm very cautious about using the word privacy in this context, because in the early Middle Ages, privacy, as we understand it, just simply didn't exist. The king was never alone. There were always people with him. There were always people sleeping in the same room as him. The king himself would have slept probably in a curtained enclosure surrounded by his affinity around him. Now, none of these manors, like Clarendon, was permanently used, and this is because, as I've already suggested, the court was continually on the move. Now, of course, there were lots of reasons for this, but I think perhaps the most important in the period that we're looking at this evening is that the monarchy still had, of course, territories on both sides of the Channel. So a king like King John might spend a great deal of time abroad. In fact, King John spent 4 of his first 10 years on the throne out of the country. But kings also needed to move around their houses and castles, and here you see a map. You don't need to read anything, you can just see the blobs, and you can see the number of possessions. They needed to move between these places to rule, hands-on ruling, to dispense justice, to administer their lands, and this did necessitate this highly mobile lifestyle. In those first 10 years that I was talking about, King John moved more than 150 times a year, travelling on average 35 to 40 miles a day. Henry II was marginally less frenetic. He moved 80 times a year. And of course, moving the medieval court was a phenomenal operation. Hundreds of horses and carts were required. When crossing the Channel, for instance, an English king usually took with him 1,000 horses. 1,000 horses across the Channel. At a normal residence, there would be stabling for perhaps 300 horses. And some of these horses were ridden by the king, his family, and the aristocracy, but many, many more, most of them probably, were pack horses, used to carry goods, either in large saddlebags or by cart. So in 1285, Edward I used 41 pack horses just to move his chapel royal goods, the kitchen silver, his clothes, and his bed. And these incredibly valuable objects would be packed up in massive chests bound with iron and securely bound with strong locks to make sure nobody pilfered anything along the way. And of course, these medieval kings were attended by a sizable household. So in 1306, the size of Edward I's household was around 200 people. And these were just his servants, of course. So who were they? Well, there was a wardrobe keeper, he had a chaplain, 2 surgeons, 2 messengers, 2 porters, 2 trumpeters, extremely important, 7 valets of the chamber, 3 grooms of the chamber, 2 chapel keepers, 55 people in the kitchen, and 68 sumpters. And sumpters were the men who, if you like, were the sort of furniture removers, the people who were responsible for moving him from place to place. And on top of this number of people, there were his affinity, his family, members of the aristocracy who attended him. And I think towards the end of Edward III's reign, right at the end of the period we're talking about tonight, the total size of the royal household on the move was between 350 and 400 people. And so moving this lot about could be a very slow process, given the state of the roads and the crudity of the wagons and carts they had. But the court actually achieved a surprising speed. In November 1200, King John left Marlborough in a hurry and arrived at Lincoln, 150 miles away, in 4 days, from there to there. That's not bad. Edward I moved from Bamborough, which I can't even reach, right at the top there, and got down to Windsor in, let me just check the number of days, which is written down here, in 18 days. That's 360 miles, slightly slower pace. So these are quite big feats, and they're quite long journeys they're making, and sometimes in quite a hurry. And organising this itinerary, moving between these places, was a very precise task. It wasn't a random series of moves. It was very carefully planned. Quite apart from anything else, the monarchy spent particular times of the year in specific places, and particularly in the great religious feasts of Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, they would need to be in particular places for crown wearings and for particular ceremonies. And they'd also want to appear at provincial residences to reinforce their judicial responsibilities, their administrative or their military policies. And, of course, crucially, have a nice time to hunt in the forests. And so these royal houses and castles, which you see on the screen, formed the points around which the court gyrated. And the king's preference dictated where they went, what was repaired, what was built, what was extended. And in each of the counties, a sheriff was responsible for keeping an eye on the royal residences in his area, for organising royal construction projects. But gradually, as time went on, just as bishops and abbots and deans employed architects to oversee big construction projects, so the king began to have in his household engineers or designers to oversee his buildings. And the first of these, about whom we know anything, was a man called Aelnoth, who was around in the 1150s, particularly working at Westminster. And under him were the master craftsmen, the masons, the carpenters, and others, technical experts who were able to build these buildings and decorate them lavishly. So far, I've characterised these royal manors in the countryside, with the court moving from place to place. Now, let me move on to our second category of residence, and these we should call towers or castles, places clearly designed to combine residence with the need to project power and provide security. Now, we know that from the 11th century, Saxon aristocrats were beginning to build such places. Here is Porchester, of course, in a Roman fort. Again, it's very difficult to see this. It looks like someone spilt their cup of coffee over this slide. Here there are a series of walls. In the middle here are the Saxon buildings, which include here a very substantial masonry tower, presumably a tower containing residential accommodation for the Saxon lord. But William the Conqueror scrubbed out all of these, and he and his immediate successors built on an imperial scale, expressing power in the language of ancient Rome. And the best known building, the most important building, of course, is the White Tower in the Tower of London. I think equally important, but unfinished, is its sister structure in Colchester. These were palaces. Be under no illusion, these were palaces made for the Duke made king. They contained suites of reception rooms. Here's a reconstruction from around 1100. Oh, golly. I tell you, the screen in front of me shows these absolutely beautifully and crisply. I'm so sorry. But what you might vaguely be able to discern here, you might not be, is a big hall, a chamber, and a chapel. You all know the White Tower. You've been in there hundreds of times before. You don't need a slide to see it. They had fireplaces with chimneys. This is probably not going to be any better. No, there they are. And, of course, they were hung with rich textiles, brightly painted furniture, etc. Now, at English Heritage, we recently completed a very interesting and exciting project, which was to try and work out what one of these great early Norman palaces actually looked like. And we had a huge and complicated research project to try and work out what the great tower at Dover Castle would have been like in the reign of Henry II. Now, Henry II built this huge great tower, great palace at Dover, and spent nearly £7,000 on it between 1180 and 1190. It was erected on the very highest point of the site, and it was surrounded by a huge wall with 14 projecting towers and great gates. But the great tower inside, for which you should read Great Palace, was approached by this extraordinary, those of you who've been there will know this extraordinary great run of staircases, passing a little chapel on the way up, leading to a first floor entrance. And at this entrance in the chapel, you could perhaps pray, give thanks for a safe journey. You then possessed over a drawbridge and past a guard room and went into the palace itself. And on the ground floor were the kitchens, and we had a go at working out what they perhaps might have looked like. And then there were 2 floors above containing magnificent suites of rooms. One for the king, we think containing some sort of a throne room, and what isn't accurate in this view is the roof. This is a great brick vault that is inserted in this room during the Napoleonic Wars. So sort of ignore that. You should have seen a flat ceiling. But this idea of textiles, a frieze, thrones, a sort of canopy, this is the sort of very colourful sight that you would have seen. A bedchamber next door with a bed, again, quite open, a room where many other people would have slept in many other beds, but the king certainly would have been in there. And a chapel also in there, and on the floor above this, another suite of rooms set out probably for the king's guests. So this was our attempt to try and convey something of the colour, something of the softness of these great early Norman palaces, which, when we visit them now, because they're ruined, always seem so hard-edged and so grey and so monotone. But Dover was no ordinary castle. It was built in a retrospective style. These great towers, these great palace towers were going out of fashion. It was built to emphasise royal gravitas and dynastic durability. So these great palaces in the towers were very much produced by a militarised society, and they were really underpinned by this developing code of conduct, which can best be summed up by the term chivalry. So from the Norman conquest, the upper classes began to develop a code of behaviour, code of manners, if you like, which centred on physical prowess, generosity, courtesy, and loyalty. Now, quite how these values, which I think you can easily understand in the context of the sort of banqueting hall at Clarendon, actually applied to the utterly gruesome business of medieval warfare is very difficult to comprehend. But this very exotic aristocratic culture was the way, I think, that the church managed to rationalise the activities of this highly militaristic society. The way, for instance, the brutality of the Crusades could be fitted into a Christian world. And in this cult of chivalry, King Arthur and his knights were a vital component, with kings and knights modelling themselves on the legendary king and on his companions. Edward I himself was a guest at the extraordinary excavation of King Arthur's grave by the monks of Glastonbury Abbey. I mean, it was absolutely, obviously a fake, nothing to do with him. And he ordered the construction of a round table that still hangs at Winchester Castle today. And his grandson, Edward III, and I really hope this one comes out, just about, built this astonishing building at Windsor Castle in 1334, a great circular building, 200 feet in diameter, to accommodate the knights of the Round Table. And they would have all sat, the knights with their backs to the wall, this great circular table here, going round, covered by arches, as part of this cult of King Arthur and his chivalry. And these Romantic and militarized ideas were very much converted into architectural style. These castles were obviously designed to defend their occupants from aggressors, but actually the style in which they built was increasingly stylized. Turrets, battlements, machicolations, drawbridges and moats were just as much elements of style as they were functional components. So just as a 18th century aristocrat might have had a Venetian window, so a 14th century or a 13th century magnate would have had his arrow loops. And the most obvious expression of all this was the obsession with heraldry. And here you see, a little bit later than what we're talking about, but these are the shields held by the angels on the roof of Westminster Hall, put up, of course, in Richard II's reign. But from 1198, English kings adopted the red shield with the 3 leopards on and plastered their buildings with it. And it was very much, I think, Henry III's lavish use of his badges everywhere that triggered this fashion for everybody to put their heraldic devices all over the buildings they built. So, finally, with this picture of Westminster on the screen, let's move on to Westminster itself, because it was Edward the Confessor who established Westminster as the seat of the monarchy, and it was he who created that extraordinary combination which you still get a sense of today of Royal Palace and Royal Abbey, the Abbey that became the Coronation Church and the Royal Mausoleum, and the Palace which gradually undertook the guise of a permanent headquarters for the monarchy. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves, because initially Westminster was just one of the places in which the monarchy resided. And although symbolically the most important, it was not in any sense a sort of capital in the modern sense. It was only in the 13th century that the peripatetic household began to leave in one place some of its administrative functions. And slowly, monarchs took less and less of the administrative apparatus they needed with them on tour, as it were, and left it in the care of clerks at Westminster, who then had offices built for them there. Well, absolutely tragically, we don't really know anything about the Saxon residences at Westminster. The archaeological evidence was probably destroyed when parliamentarians decided to dig a big car park in front of Westminster Hall, an underground car park, in the 1970s. So that wiped out any information we had about that. But of course, what we do have is the fabric of Westminster Great Hall, the centrepiece of the Norman Royal Palace at Westminster, 240 feet long, 67.5 feet wide, and of course at that time without this roof that is added later. This roof is added by Richard II, and the first hall had great trusses, huge beams stretching across the hall like this with trusses, creating this extraordinary open space. But Westminster Hall was a piece of architectural megalomania. It was not in any sense a practical solution to the everyday needs of the monarch. Indeed, it was only used for very specific and limited series of functions. It was used for coronation ceremonials, receptions of foreign emissaries, for councils, occasionally for Parliament, for demonstrating royal liberality, sort of charity events, and of course, on a day-to-day basis, for the accommodation of the lower members of the court as a sort of giant doss house or giant dormitory. And for this reason, when Henry III came to the throne, it was joined by another hall to the south, which you can't really see here, I'm afraid, and then by other buildings. I've got a better plan that I will show you in a moment. And these lesser halls you see on the screen here were used on a day-to-day basis, and the most important of these was the painted chamber, which you see here in a record drawing before it was destroyed by the great fire that destroyed the medieval palace of Westminster, so famously painted by Turner and everybody else who rushed to record its destruction. And this room contained an extraordinary series of murals painted on the wall, and in it was the king's bed. Sorry, this is again not very good, but it's good enough to see. So here is the lesser hall, and here is the painted chamber. Here is the king's chapel just off it, and in this area here, in a curtained enclosure with like a sort of tabernacle, really, like a tabernacle in a church, was the king's bed. And it may well have been that this bed was placed on the very spot where they believed that Edward the Confessor had died. The bed was part bed but part shrine, and very, very closely linked via this little thing with the king's chapel. In fact, there was a squint through the wall which allowed him to look from his bed enclosure at Mass being celebrated in the chapel, and in fact there was also a gallery which linked from here to St. Stephen's Chapel, the main palace chapel, up there. And of course, the palace was not just a palace standing by itself, because it was a complex which also embraced the abbey itself. And the structures of the abbey were very much part of this. The chapter house, for instance, which you see here, was always intended for royal use, right from the beginning, a meeting place for Parliament and for other sort of great councils. But by the time Westminster was being developed by Henry III, there had begun to be some crucial developments in palatial architecture. As we've seen, up until the 12th century, the houses of the rich were generally an agglomeration of separate structures: hall, chamber, and kitchen. And this was, in fact, why the king's rural residences were known as the houses, a plural name, because they were a bit like a village. But from the 1180s, houses began to adopt a new arrangement that was to become the standard layout. Oh dear. Right, we'll do it with this one instead. Standard layout for all houses of pretension for the following 400 years. Now, this is the Bishop's Palace at Lincoln, and what came about was the Great Hall with a kitchen linked to it at the end, with a buttery and a pantry, with 3 doors, the 3 doors giving access to the kitchen, to the buttery, and to the pantry. And then at the other end of the Great Hall, access to the royal chambers, or the chambers of the bishop, with an access, a porch to give access at the lower end with the kitchen, which led to a dais here, and then a screen's passage here, a screen here, and then a dais at the top end there with a bay window. And this layout that develops, I think, first in episcopal palaces, soon becomes the norm for everybody else. Let's just see here. Yes, so there you see the ruin of Lincoln. This is the Great Hall here, and here are those 3 doors going to the buttery, pantry, and the kitchen. And that big wall there is the back part of the kitchen itself. So what do these changes, which started off in episcopal palaces, mean for the royal palaces? Well, as we shall see, they eventually led to a radically different sort of royal residence. But although a bishop's palace had quite a lot in common with a royal residence, the two just simply weren't the same. At the very least, a royal palace had to accommodate a king and a queen, whereas bishops were celibate and lived by themselves. But I think more importantly, these palaces, the bishop's palaces, were occupied by the bishop for the time being. They weren't handing them on to members of their families, quite unlike kings, who were wanting quite often to create a dynastic memorial. And so we start to see in the in royal buildings an enthusiasm to create something that was a little bit more coherent. So here is the White Tower. I'm going to move on to the... Oh, dear. I had a real problem with my scanning today, but this is the White Tower you can see at the back here. And what I'm showing you is Henry III's and Edward I's additions to the Tower of London, a great hall, chamber for the Queen, a chamber for the King, an inner chamber or bedchamber for the Queen and for the King, and here on the river, the St Thomas's Tower, built by Edward I. And so you see that by the reign of Edward I, we start to get a much more sort of coherent view of the way these buildings are planned. And perhaps we can see it better here at Conwy Castle. So this is about 1300. And you can see how incredibly neat this little palace is. This is the first floor rooms. So you have a sort of a hall, a sort of presence chamber. Just off it, the King's Tower, containing some little private rooms, and beyond that, an inner room and a study or a closet. And below that, a beer cellar or wine cellar, probably a buttery, and then the kitchen, linked by stairs, which allowed things to be brought up to these chambers. So you have this, because of the nature of a castle, a much more compact design, much more compact than you get in the king's houses at places like Clarendon. And so let's move on finally to Edward III, extraordinary king, living through extraordinary times, an incredibly warlike king. For 60 years, between 1290 and 1350, England was sort of continuously at war. These wars weren't skirmishes, they involved huge armies, 20,000 men or more fighting each other, ships, horses, castles, extended supply lines, you sort of name it really, heavy taxation. And then, of course, in the midst of all this, in 1348, the Black Death, half the population killed. It's all incredibly inconvenient, basically. And it's amazing that amongst all this catastrophe, war, tax, death, Edward III continues to pursue the 100 Years' War, first quite successfully, capturing the King of France, eliciting a £500,000 ransom, which is very handy in building castles, which we can talk about in a moment. But then later, as he gets older, losing everything that he'd won, and ending in rather a sad state, having alienated large amounts of the population. So this extraordinary background against which he really becomes one of the greatest builders of the Middle Ages, Henry III and then Edward III, building extraordinary, really. And his two big important works, one is at Westminster, where he spends £30,000, and then at Windsor Castle, where he spends over £50,000. Now, I don't really want to talk about Westminster a lot, but here you see the undercroft of St Stephen's Chapel, which still survives. It's used by MPs. The superstructure above has gone, but this is the incredibly lavish original chapel that is built by Edward III. When I say original, I mean innovative, based on the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to be the principal chapel of the principal royal palace. But although this is incredibly influential sort of stylistically, the building I really want to talk about is Windsor Castle. Because here, Edward III sets the standard for 150 years of royal and aristocratic building. Over a period of 18 years, at a cost of £51,000, he rebuilds the royal lodgings in the upper ward. So there's a lower ward here that's got St George's Chapel in it. You've got the Norman motte with a keep on the top. And here we have, in the upper ward, Edward III's extraordinary royal palace, replacing buildings that had been put up there by Henry III. And so this building, which you see an elevation of here, is Edward III's palace. To us, it may look incredibly austere and monotonous, but to the contemporary observer, it was a radical building. It's a huge secular facade, much bigger than anything else that had been built before. It gave no clue of the individual buildings within. It just carried on with this repetitive fenestration, unlike any other building that had been built before, the king's houses, where each structure expressed a building within. This is just a great block within which the buildings, the lodgings are arranged. And the first entering through one of these great gatehouses, you had a choice through which one you entered, but probably normally the left one, you could enter St. George's Hall, Edward III's great hall, which you see here in the reign of Charles II, as depicted by Holler. And here you see the plan of the rooms themselves. This is the bottom one here that you want to look at. This is that great hall I've just shown you, approached by a great stair here. And visitors who had been to this hall would go along a cloister here, past the chapel. So this is that great facade I just showed you. Behind that facade, the chapel, the hall. On the other side of the gatehouse are the king's rooms. So if you're a visitor, you'd have come up to the hall, you'd have walked along this cloister, entered this antechamber. Here is the vast king's great chamber, his outer chamber. Here is his tower. Here is his presence chamber. And here is his bedchamber looking out over the Thames Valley. And then here a series of smaller rooms and the Queen's rooms coming around on this side. You can see how coherent this is. This is a building that has been carefully thought out, that has been built in a single campaign, that deliberately seeks to bring those disparate structures that had been characteristic of royal houses together in a single coherent whole. So what we have seen take place this evening is a big transition. First of all, the monarchy and the country acquired a headquarters. This is Westminster Hall, a capital, if you like. In the reign of Henry III, the Exchequer was given a permanent home at Westminster in a purpose-built structure. Then in the 13th century came the Court of Common Pleas, followed 100 years later by the Court of the King's Bench. And the arrival of these courts in Westminster made it both the administrative headquarters of the kingdom and the king's principal residence. So that's the first thing that happens. You get Westminster becoming the headquarters. Secondly, royal houses, like the houses of the episcopate and the aristocracy, moved to be more compact, more coherent, both in design and in function. A standardized arrangement developed, still centered on a great hall, but with functions disposed around the hall in a regular and logical fashion. Thirdly, the range of accommodation available to the monarch expanded. No longer was there a separate building which the king could retreat away from the hall, but there were 1, 2, and eventually 3 chambers beyond the hall into which the monarch could retreat. And beyond this, maybe a study or an oratory too. And many of these houses had private towers. Fourthly, standards of luxury and comfort in the principal residences like Westminster, Windsor and Clarendon hugely increased. For instance, Edward III built a bathhouse at Westminster. It had hot and cold running water controlled by 2 large bronze taps. He was also responsible for building a clock tower, complete with a clock which the public could see. And I just mentioned these refinements just to illustrate how luxurious these places got. So there are some fundamental changes. But I think it is difficult to say that the court of Edward III was much less of a warband than that of his predecessors. And more importantly, we will see when I continue next month on the 12th of March that although Windsor was big and magnificent, the richest of his courtiers were building houses of similar pretension. Kings were still leaders of armies, of a band of soldiers, and not much more elevated above them than those who were under their command. And this, as we shall see, will lead to many complications, but also eventually to a resolution under the Tudors in the early 16th century. So I hope you will join me next month to see what happens next between the death of Edward III and the accession of Henry VIII. Thank you very much.